At 84, Paul Anka is finally peeling back the curtain on a story he's kept locked away for decades. A story that rewrites everything you thought you knew about him, about Frank Sinatra, and about the price of being in the inner circle of a living legend. This isn't a gentle memoir or a nostalgic tribute. It's a confession, equal parts awe, admiration, and fear. For years, Anka called Sinatra a friend, a mentor, even a brother. But behind the tuxedos, champagne, and standing ovations was something far more complicated. An unspoken tension, a code of silence, and an invisible line you didn't dare cross. In a rare new interview, Anka doesn't just honor Sinatra's memory, he dismantles the myth, piece by piece. He shares what he saw inside Sinatra's world, the things he was asked to do, the things he refused, and the moments that made him question everything. Before all that, Paul Anka was just a teenager from Ottawa, armed with nothing but a pencil, a piano, and a dream so loud no one around him could ignore it. At 15, he wrote Diana, a heartbreak anthem that didn't just put him on the map, it exploded him onto the world stage. Suddenly, he wasn't just a kid with talent. He was a force of his own, touring globally, writing for other stars, and standing alongside the biggest names of the 50s before he was even old enough to drink. But nothing he had done up to that point could compare to the moment he sat alone in a New York hotel room and wrote the song that would change both his life and Sinatra's forever. My Way, adapted from a French tune, infused with his own English lyrics, it wasn't a song for Paul Anka to sing. It was written for one man and one man only, Frank Sinatra. Anka has said it felt like writing a eulogy for someone who was still alive. When Sinatra heard it, he didn't just like it. He claimed it. It became his song, his story, his legacy. And Paul Anka, barely out of his teens, watched as My Way rose to mythical status, played at funerals, quoted by presidents, forever linked to the name Frank Sinatra. Most people never knew the kid from Ottawa had written it. Even fewer knew what that song truly cost him, because that song wasn't just a hit, it was Anka's ticket into Sinatra's world. A world where the Rat Pack wasn't just a group of entertainers, it was a machine, and Sinatra was the king. Getting close to him wasn't something you just did, it was something you were allowed to do. And with that privilege came invisible strings, ones no one dared to pull. From the outside, Anka seemed to be living the dream. From the inside, he was learning fast that in Sinatra's orbit, loyalty wasn't optional, and survival meant knowing exactly when to speak and when to stay silent. It was dazzling, it was dangerous, and it was only the beginning of a relationship that would test the limits of trust, power, and friendship. Sammy Davis Jr. brought the soul, Dean Martin brought the swagger, and Frank Sinatra brought a silence so sharp it could freeze a room. Paul Anka says Sinatra's power wasn't just artistic, it was political. You didn't cross Frank. You didn't tell him no. You played the game, or you vanished. Nights in Vegas weren't just about music. They were about unseen hands making quiet decisions. And sometimes even Sinatra seemed cautious about the company in the room. Anka knew the rules. Stay useful, stay respectful, and above all, stay quiet. But one night in a smoky Las Vegas dressing room, that loyalty was tested. Anka, still in his 20s and riding high from My Way, walked in eager to share new arrangements. Sinatra was already there, flanked by two men in suits, a half-empty bottle of Jack on the table. Paul offered a handshake. Frank didn't look up. Then came the whisper, laced with disdain. "Don't forget who made that song matter, kid." It hit harder than Anka expected. In that moment, he realized My Way no longer belonged to him. It belonged to Sinatra, and the world agreed. Paul swallowed his pride, smiled faintly, and walked away. The show went on, but something inside him shifted. That was the night he stopped being just a fan and started seeing the truth. In Sinatra's world, gratitude faded fast, respect had an expiration date, and love was always a transaction. Years later, Paul Anka would call that night a turning point, not a betrayal. It was when he realized he was in the presence of greatness, but also danger. Frank could love you on Monday and forget you on Tuesday. From then on, Anka stood on his own, seeing both Frank and fame differently. The whispers about Sinatra's connections never stopped, and one night in the early 70s, they became real. After a Chicago show, Anka was ushered into a quiet penthouse room with three men. Smiles, drinks, then a paper slid across the table. vague, open-ended, and understanding. Protection, access, favors in exchange for certain gigs, untraceable payments, and no questions about certain names. One man said, "Frank thinks this would be good for you." Another added, "You sign this, your family." Anka didn't sign. He thanked them, claimed he needed his lawyer, and left with his heart pounding. Weeks later, calls went unanswered. A show was mysteriously canceled, and then the tension faded. He believes Sinatra didn't send those men, but didn't stop them either. In Frank's world, saying no didn't always make you a target. Sometimes it made you invisible, and Anka refused to disappear. My Way was his masterpiece, but for decades he rarely sang it. Not because he didn't love it, but because, in truth, it had never really belonged to him again. Paul Anka took a French ballad, reshaped it with his own words, and created My Way, a song perfectly tailored to Sinatra's voice and persona. When Frank sang it, it became his story, so powerful the world believed it was carved from his own life. Anka's name was in the credits, but lost in the shadow of the legend. For decades, he didn't try to reclaim it, out of respect, fear, and complicated loyalty. Every time it played at a funeral or farewell, Anka felt both pride and pain, knowing he had written something timeless, yet could never truly own it. After Sinatra's death in 1998, Anka stayed quiet, only later performing My Way again, this time telling its true origin and reclaiming it as his testimony. But behind the music, he had seen a side of Sinatra few dared to discuss, especially when it came to women. In Sinatra's world, there were unspoken rules. Don't flirt with the wrong woman, don't look too long, never question who she came with. Violate that, and you could lose a career, or worse. Anka recalls parties where women arrived and vanished under watchful eyes. In Palm Springs, a young starlet was escorted out mid-party for laughing too loudly at another man's joke, and never returned to that circle. The power dynamics were unmistakable, and Anka learned early to keep his head down. In that world, silence wasn't weakness, it was survival. Paul Anka saw how men around Sinatra copied his possessive ways, convinced that power excused anything. It was a culture built on charm, control, and fear, protected by fame. At 84, Anka looks back without sugarcoating, acknowledging the darkness behind the glamour and the women reduced to props. Back then, speaking out meant exile. For decades, he played the polished gentleman of showbiz, well-dressed, well-spoken, and famously discreet. When asked about Sinatra, he smiled. When pressed, he deflected. Behind that charm was a man carrying the weight of silence. In his words, "You didn't survive by telling the truth. You survived by protecting it." Sinatra was both his hero and a volatile figure surrounded by people who didn't tolerate criticism, especially from the kid in the room. Anka stayed quiet to protect his career, his family, and his place in the industry. He watched as legacies were rewritten, silence rewarded, and truth punished. But with age came clarity. In his 80s, with nothing left to lose, he decided it was time. "This isn't revenge, it's release," he said. For the first time, Paul Anka is telling the full story, stripping away the myth to reveal the tension, manipulation, and hidden costs of fame. At 84, he's done being quiet. After a lifetime in Frank Sinatra's shadow, Paul Anka has finally stepped into the light, not with bitterness, but with clarity. He's no longer the teenager eager to impress the Rat Pack or the songwriter watching his anthem be claimed by another man. He's the survivor who navigated the golden age of show business without being swallowed by it. Now his legacy isn't just as the man behind My Way, but as the man who finally found his own way. What Anka shares today peels back decades of myth-making. Sinatra will always be a giant in American music, but even giants cast shadows, and Anka had to live in them. For too long, the truth about My Way and their complicated relationship, filled with closeness, control, reverence, and fear, was buried under nostalgia and old Hollywood charm. But now Anka is writing the final verse, and this time, he's the one singing it. His performances carry a different weight, less tribute, more declaration. Every lyric feels like his story now, not Sinatra's. As the spotlight fades, one truth stands out. Paul Anka never needed to borrow greatness. He carried it all along. At 84, he's done seeking approval and letting others define his legacy. By speaking openly about the power, the pain, the silence, and the song. He's given the world something Sinatra never could: perspective. My Way may have made Frank famous, but it was Paul's pen that gave it life. After decades of loyalty and restraint, he's reclaimed that legacy, not with revenge, but with truth. Sometimes the strongest voice isn't the one that roars, but the one that waits, watches, and finally sings without fear. Paul Anka didn't just survive the golden age, he wrote its soundtrack. And now the final note is his, and it's his way.